A man walks alone through the Swiss mountains. The wind cuts his face. His eyes burn not from the altitude, but from the myopia that is slowly blinding him. He carries notebooks, thoughts too dense for the world around him. He writes furiously. He publishes books, and nobody, absolutely nobody read or understand. This man is Friedrich Nietzsche, and he will die mad, alone, misunderstood. Grab your whiskey so we can delve deeper into the subject. The philosopher nobody wanted to understand. If you're looking for uncomfortable truths that no one dares to say, you're in the right place. Subscribe to the channel. You'll need it. Nietzsche once wrote, "I write for a time that has not yet arrived." And he was right. But what happens when you're too profound for your own time? When your ideas are so radical that no one can process them? When you die without knowing if anyone will ever truly understand you? Let's find out together. Imagine this. You dedicate your entire life to thinking, creating, and writing works that you, Hinostat, will change the world. You work yourself to death. You publish books. And when they finally reach the shelves, nobody buys them. Nobody reads them. Nobody caris. This is not a metaphor. This was Nietzsche's life. When he published Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the one he considered his masterpiece, the beating heart of all his thought, do you know how many copies it sold in the first year? 40 copies? You probably have more followers on Instagram than he had readers. And the worst part, it wasn't a lack of quality. It was an excess. Nietzsche was too profound, too radical, too disturbing for his time. He was writing for a future that didn't yet exist, engaging with minds that hadn't yet been born. Look at the irony. Today he is one of the most widely read, quoted, and misunderstood philosophers in history. But during his lifetime, invisible, his letters reveal a silent despair. He wrote to friends, to intellectuals, begging for dialogue, for someone who would understand him. And he received in return silence, or worse, polite incomprehension. That kind of empty response that says very interesting when in reality it means I didn't understand anything and I don't want to understand. Nietzsche lived a radical solitude. Not physical solitude any hermits experiences that, but intellectual solitude. The solitude of one who thinks alone in the dark, without answer, without a mirror. Now tell me, would you have the courage to continue writing knowing that no one will read you? Knowing that your genius will die with you? He did, and he continued. Because Nietzsche did not write to be understood. Now he wrote to transcend time. To reach you today, decades later, sitting there with your whiskey and your own existential doubts. But here's the first problem. When you write for the future, the present crucifies you. And that's exactly what happened. Nietzsche's solitude was not merely intellectual. It was existential. It was the solitude of someone who sees the world from an angle that no one else can see. Of someone who shouts truths that no one wants to hear. Of someone who dies without knowing if their voice will echo or be lost in the void. Spoiler, it echoed. But in ways he never imagined, and not always in the right way. Take a deep breath for a moment, because the story only gets worse from here. Imagine dying, and then years later, discovering that they've turned you into the intellectual symbol of everything you hated. They took his words, distorted them, manipulated them, and used them to justify genocide, blind nationalism, and mass barbarity. Welcome to the posthumous nightmare of Friedrich Nietzsche. Let's make one thing perfectly clear. Nietzsche was not a Nazi. He died in 1900 decades before the Third Reich existed. But that didn't stop them from making him Hitler's ideological spokesperson. And do you know who orchestrated this historical farce? His own sister Elizabeth, that name should be synonymous with intellectual betrayal. When Nietzsche suffered a mental breakdown in 1889, Elizabeth took control of his work. And she wasn't just his sister, she was a staunch anti-Semite, married to a racist colonialist, and utterly enamored with German nationalism. Everything Nietzsche despised. She edited her manuscripts, she deleted passages, she invented others. She compiled loose fragments and created a fake work called The Will to Power, as if it were Nietzsche's philosophical testament. And he sold all of this to the Nazis, as if it were an ideological manual. Hitler visited Nietzsche's archive. He posed for photos next to the philosopher's bust. Elizabeth offered Nietzsche's cane as a gift to the Führer. Nazi propaganda quoted Nietzsche as if he were the prophet of the Reich. And here is the cruelest irony of history. Nietzsche categorized nationalism. He called Germans a crude people, fiercely criticized anti-Semitism, and broke off friendships over these issues. He even broke with Richard Wagner's idol, his closest friend, because Wagner had become an anti-Semitic nationalist. Nietzsche wrote, "I am pure Polish, that's a lie." But he only said that to distance himself from German identity. He praised the Jews as a strong, resilient people. He despised its state, militarism, blind patriotism, and yet, decades later, there was her image being used to justify concentration camps. Can you imagine the magnitude of this betrayal? To transform a fierce critic of German nationalism into philosophical symbol of Nazism. It's as if they took Gandhi and turned him into a mascot for an arms company. It's grotesque. It's obscene. And that's exactly what happened. This is the biggest misunderstanding in the history of philosophy. And it wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate manipulation, orchestrated by someone who was supposed to protect his legacy. Nietzsche died insane, unable to defend himself. And when the world finally paid attention to him, it was to distort everything he stood for. Think about it. You can be brilliant. You can be right. You can shout truths to the wind. And even then, after you're gone, they'll take your words and twist them until they mean the opposite. Nietzsche was buried twice. First, by indifference, then by distortion. And even today, there are people who think he was a fascist. Of course, there's always that uncle who thinks Nietzsche was Hitler's philosopher. There always is. Here's one of the biggest misunderstandings about Nietzsche. Everyone thinks he hated Jesus Christ, that he was a raging atheist, a blasphemer who spat on religion for pure destructive pleasure. Wrong. Completely wrong. Nietzsche wrote a book called The Antichrista titled Doesn't Help, I admit. But if you actually read the work and don't just repeat what you've heard, you realize something disturbing. Nietzsche admired Christ. Yes, you read that right. He admired Jesus as authentic rebel for Nietzsche. Christ was an example of someone who created his own morality, who lived radically to the very end. He lived according to his own values, rejected the hypocrisy of institutions, and preached love and freedom instead of blind obedience. The problem wasn't Christ. The problem was Christianity. And what about this distinction? This subtle yet gigantic difference. Nobody understood it. Nietzsche wasn't attacking the figure of Jesus. He was attacking what they did to Jesus, the church, the doctrine, the herd, morality, the transformation of a spiritual rebel into an instrument of social control. He saw Christianity as a betrayal of the spirit of Christ, a religion that took a man who preached a full life and transformed it into a cult of guilt, suffering, and the denial of earthly existence. The last Christian died on the cross. "I am sorry," wrote Nietzsche. And it wasn't contempt, it was lament. For him, Christ was unique. And what came after was an institutionalized distortion, a machine of spiritual domestication that transformed free sheep into an obedient flock. Nietzsche fights against Christian morality, that which glorifies weakness, which transforms suffering into virtue, which teaches men to bow down, to ask forgiveness for existing, to live on his knees, awaiting a reward in the afterlife. He wasn't against spirituality. He was against spirituality that denies life, against religion that teaches you to hate this world to deserve the next one. Remain faithful to the land, don't run away from life, he shouted. Don't treat it like a veil of tears. Live existence in all its cruelty, beauty, and pain. But of course, nobody wanted to understand that nuance. It's easier to label. Nietzsche is an atheist, therefore he is against everything that is sacred. No. He was against what is false, against performative spirituality, against using God as an excuse not to live life to the fullest. Now tell me, do you truly believe what you say you believe? Or are you just repeating the script they gave you? Do you live according to your own values or according to what you were taught to value? Nietzsche asked these questions. And people preferred to call him a blasphemer rather than answer honestly, because nothing is more human than avoiding difficult questions, right? The ultimate irony. Nietzsche criticized Christianity for turning people into unthinking sheep. And what did they do to him? They transformed his criticisms into simplistic slogans, devoid of reflection and depth. Nietzsche said that God is dead, therefore he is evil. Yeah, that's exactly the superficial interpretation he feared. Nietzsche was not the Antichrist. He was the anti-comfortable lie But how do you try to explain that to a crowd that prefers superficial certainties to uncomfortable truths? Jude luck. Here's another gem of misunderstanding. They call Nietzsche a nihilist. Teachers repeat it, students memorize it. Even people who have never read a line of his repeat it with conviction. Ah, Nietzsche, that nihilist. And every time that happens, Nietzsche's ghost probably has a philosophical aneurysm, because here is the inconvenient truth. His entire body of work, every book, every aphorism, every philosophical hammer blow is antidotato nihilism. But people confuse diagnosing the disease with the Beatty disease. Let me explain. When Nietzsche declared that God is dead, he wasn't celebrating. He was making a cultural diagnosis. He was saying, look, folks, humanity has killed God. We've destroyed absolute values, metaphysical certainties, the moral foundation that underpinned everything. And now, what comes next? He was pointing to the existential void it was coming. Nihilism. The feeling that nothing matters, that everything is empty, that there is no purpose, no meaning, no real values, and he was terrified, therefore. Nietzsche didn't want a world without values. He wanted a world with them. New values created by ourselves, not inherited from external authorities. Values that affirm life instead of denying it. His entire philosophy was a desperate attempt to answer, how can we live fully in a world without God? How do we create meaning without appealing to the afterlife? The Übermensch, the eternal return. The will to power all of these were tools against nihilism ways of saying yes to existence, even after all metaphysical crutches had been ripped away. But nobody paid attention to that. They saw a man deconstructing old values and thought, so he wants to destroy everything. They saw someone criticizing traditional morality and concluded, then he doesn't believe in anything. It's like going to the doctor, being diagnosed with cancer, and leaving saying, that doctor gave me cancer. Nietzsche was a doctor, nihilism was the disease, and the patient got everything mixed up. Via nihilism arrived like an inevitable storm. He saw modernity emptying traditional values without offering anything in their place. And he cried out, beware, we need new values. We need to create meaning. But they shouted back, shut up, nihilist. The tragedy here is visceral. Nietzsche spent his life fighting precisely that for which he became known. Now, tell me something honestly. Do you feel that your life has purpose? Or do you just, he pretends, why is it more comfortable than facing the void? Nietzsche kept pushing this question, and people preferred to label him a nihilist rather than face the answer. Because it's easier to accuse the messenger than to process the message, isn't it? Nietzsche was not a nihilist. He was the last man trying to prevent humanity from drowning in nihilism. He reached out, and they called it a push. Even today, in the 21st century, you find people who swear that Nietzsche preached nothing matters, people who use his quotes out of context to justify cheap cynicism and existential apathy. He wanted the opposite. He wanted you to credere importancy that inventas civilis, that he loved life so intensely that he would accept living it infinitely. Of course, it's easier to get a tattoo that says God is dead and think you understand Nietzsche. Spoiler, he didn't understand. And now we come to the end, to collapse, to the tragedy that encompasses all tragedies. January 3rd, 1889, Turin, Italy. Nietzsche goes for a walk and sees a coachman beating a horse in the street. He runs to the animal, embraces its neck, and bursts into tears. This is Friedrich Nietzsche's last moment of lucidity. After that, 11 years of silence, 11 years of vegetating, 11 years without writing a single word, without recognizing anyone, without being. Przenchi's mind, that brilliant, fierce, restless mind, simply went blank. Syphilis, brain tumor, existential burnout. No one knows for sure. But the result was the same. The philosopher who dedicated his life to thinking, to creating, to shouting uncomfortable truths, spent his last years as a silent shadow. His mother cared for him. Then his sister Elizabeth, yes, the same one who would later betray his legacy. She displayed him like a trophy. She took visitors to see the great philosopher. Nietzsche was there, physically, but he died on August 25th, 1900, without knowing he would become famous, without knowing he would be read, without knowing his story would be distorted. And here's the ultimate irony, the final blow of fate. Nietzsche was only understood, or rather, still understood, misunderstood. After he could no longer defend himself. When he was alive, nobody read him. When he went mad, he couldn't respond. When he died, they did whatever they wanted with him. Think about how cruel this is. You write for the future. The future arrives and it distorts everything. Nietzsche spent his life fighting the herd, and the herd turned him into a shepherd of fascism. He fought nihilism, and they called him a nihilist. He admired Christ and was labeled a blasphemer. He proposed radical freedom, and they made him a symbol of tyranny. He died alone, mad, and misunderstood. And he remains misunderstood to this day. How many people quote Nietzsche without ever having read a page of his work? How many tattoo quotes out of context? How many use his name to validate ideas hateful? Most of it, Nietzsche was a man out of his time. And when you're out of time, time crushes you. Now answer one last time. Was it worth it? Writing for a future that distorts you? Thinking alone in the abyss, knowing that no one will understand? Perhaps because even distorted, even misunderstood, Nietzsche is still here. His words still disturb. His questions still unsettle. His philosophy still compels you to think. And in the end, perhaps that's it. Perhaps Nietzsche's tragedy isn't that he was misunderstood. Perhaps it's that he forces us to realize that we are all misunderstood, that we all die before seeing the true impact of what we've done, that we all live betting on a future without guarantees. Nietzsche embraced a horse and lost his mind. But before that, he left us with a question that no one can escape. Do you have the courage to live knowing that you might die misunderstood? Because he had it, and he paid the price. Empty whiskey? Fill your glass. The next abyss awaits you. Subscribe to the channel.